Hello, my name is Dimiter and welcome to another session of Blender for Concept and Architectural Design. In this final session of this small series about the Pavilion, we'll learn how to set up cameras in a couple of different ways, 3 ways actually. We'll learn how to set up our render settings using Blender Internal, which is very good for quick concept renders. We'll learn how to apply materials, how to actually render the scene, and then I'll show you a little script that I've gotten with the help of the Blender community for batch rendering all the cameras we have in the view. Right, so without further delay, let's start. So this is where we've left off before. You can see I have a couple of layers turned off. I have this layer turned off, which stores my trees. So I'll click anywhere here to add a cursor, and let's add a camera, which we can do with Shift A or with this add menu over here. So we have a camera now. Let's move it up, and let's go inside of it. So we can do that by going to View, Camera, and now we see exactly what the camera sees. By the way, before I forget, let me turn on my screencast keys. And also another thing that is quite important to mention is if you go in the Properties panel here, in Shading, it's good to turn on ambient occlusion a little bit. You see how it adds that extra bit of shadow there. It makes things a little bit easier to see if they're the same tone or without a material as they currently are. Okay, so now back to the important stuff. So we're inside of the camera, and that's where the camera is looking. Inside of this properties view, if you click under the view tab, so it should be somewhere relatively high up. You can, by the way, close all the ones that you don't need, so we don't get distracted by loads of stuff. Okay, so if you click lock camera to view, and now you try to rotate, you can see that what happens is that we're actually moving our camera, which is great for lining. So now let's go and set up sort of a bird's eye view. And whoa, what's happening? Our stuff is disappearing? No. Okay, well that's okay. If you go into the camera tab with the camera selected, and we change the clipping end to 500 meters. Okay, now it appears. It was just clipping stuff that was beyond that 100. All right, so I think we got a lot of trees here, so I'm mindful of that, and that's why putting the camera where it is, because in my last couple of tries of recording this tutorial, my camera did not look good once I had the trees. Great, so we have something like this. This is a nice first camera. It's going to give us exactly where the pavilion is inside of the context. In fact, maybe we just zoom out a little bit, and we can modify this any way we want. So something like this, just so we can see the tops of the buildings. And yeah, we're gonna have loads of trees inside of here, which are quite large. All right, so that's one way to set a camera, which is we just go inside of it and we click lock camera to view. Once we have the view set up, just make sure you uncheck it. Otherwise, and now we can exit out of it. Otherwise, we would have to sort of realign it based on what we had before. Good. Now I'm just going to scale this camera by, let's say, 5. The scale, if we go back inside of it, it doesn't matter what the scale is. I just went to view camera, by the way, which you can do with shortcut, which is listed here, or Control 4 if you're using the UH Studio hotkeys. When we scale it, it makes it a little bit easier to see in the viewport. Alright, so let's add another camera. I'll add it around here. Shift A, camera. Move it up a little bit. You can see where the camera is, the way that it's facing. So this one we're doing a little bit of a different way. First, let's make it the active camera. We can tell the active camera, let me just scale it by 5 so they're the same size. You can tell the active camera by having this triangle in the front shaded. This one doesn't have it shaded, so it's not active. This one is. So now if we make this the active camera by going to View, Cameras, Set Active Object as Camera. Now that becomes our active camera. If we exit out of it, you can see that this one has the shaded triangle now and this one doesn't. Great, so one step done. And now let's just, ignoring where the camera is, kind of set a view that we sort of like. Something like this. Let's just make sure that that's all in the middle. Alright, so once we have a view that we like, and this being our active camera, what we can do is we can align that camera to this specific view by going to View, Align Active Camera to View. So you see we have it here, aligned more or less to the center of where our viewport was. So, and we can further refine the location rotation of this camera by just using the location or rotation tools within the properties panel. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is just make sure that this is 1.7 off the ground. Rotation in the X would make it 90 degrees, so it's head on directly. And then we can just rotate with the Z to sort of get the axis that we want. And then we can either move it this way or any way we want. We can even move it in the viewport and so on. Right, so now we have this second camera aligned based on a different way, and let's put a third camera which we'll put somewhere along this side. So Shift A, add camera, just move this a little bit out here, just scale with 5 so it's a little bit easier to see. Oops. Then I'll add an empty. And essentially what this empty here is going to do is going to act as our camera target. So let's actually, didn't scale this one. Let me just scale it. Again, scaling doesn't really affect the view in any way. It just makes the object appear larger in the viewport. Alright, so let me just name these. Now, if I go into the object properties, let's call it view 01 bird's eye, if I can spell correctly. How's usually the good one at spelling? My sister was not. Control 6. So yeah, we can see it here coming up in the viewport now and also everywhere else. It's going to be important for later, and I think it's also quite nice to sort of know which camera does exactly what. Okay, so let's name this camera here view 02 street south. Okay. And so this here is going to be view 03 street north. And just you can put it, yeah, you can essentially name this any way you want. Alright, now one thing I want to do also is this empty here that we've got. Scale it up a little bit as well so it's easier to see. I'll name this view 03 target. So we sort of know based on the name that it's related to view 03. By the way, in here, if you want to zoom to the selected target, you can go to view show active, or you can see it's the little dot on your number pad. Or if you're using the UH Studio hotkeys, it's Control 6. Okay, so now we have an empty, we have a camera. What we want to do is constrain the camera to this empty to track it. So if you first click our camera, and we go into this panel here, which is the constraints. Add an object constraint, track to, target. We can just target object by clicking around it, and it should sort of hover and give us the name. That's not the right one. Plane. It's not working. Anyways, I'll hit escape. Well, I know the name of it, so we can either do it this way. If I turned off, let's see, if I go into wireframe, that should work. So if I click my camera again, yes, there you go. So now we have the right object selected. So now this is constrained towards it, but you see it's kind of facing the wrong way. So all we need to do is in this constraints, I don't know what to call it, I guess modifier or constraint, this type of constraint, there you go. Improving my English every day. So in this constraints window, we just need to change the camera orientation. So up axis, y axis, and so on. So if we just make this one here, up is y, and 2 is negative z, and that now makes sure that it's facing the right way. Great, so now we're gonna do the same thing that we did with the other object, with the other camera, and I'll just change the Z of the camera to 1.7 meters. And for the time being, also for the empty, we'll make it 1.7. Great, so now if I click my camera, view, camera, set active object as camera, you can see what's happening here, right? So we can also go to the quad view here, which is a quite nice thing that Blender has. You can do that by just hitting the space bar and typing quad, and it'll come up. So what's nice is we can see what the camera is facing, and we can sort of see top view at the same time. So now if I move, let's just go to shaded, which is the Z, or you can do it from this window here. So now we can start to see what we're seeing. Now I want to just move the target a little bit higher. Let's just move the camera a little bit out. And you can see it's quite nice because we don't need to manually rotate. It sort of knows which way to rotate already. So I think something like this is quite nice. The other thing we can do is also change our camera focal length. So this is if you want to make it seem a bit more zoomed in, like this, or if you want to make it a little bit more wide angled. And as you know, I'm sure for architecture, wide angle many times works quite well. Alright, so that's our last view that we have set up with a constraint that's a target. Great, so now that we have our 3 cameras set up, just seeing I have a little bit of an error here with my geometry as it's not touching the ground, so I'm just gonna go to this gauge and really quickly edit it. See, this should do it here. Just see. Back into our camera view. Okay, that's better. Cool, so now we have our cameras set up, and I'm gonna exit out of quad view. We can just spacebar it, it's back here. Always a good idea to save. And world view. Okay, so in here is where we have our render settings, because if we try to render this right now in the viewport, which is again in here we have wireframe, shaded view, material view, and also rendered view. And we see what we get, which is not much. It's quite easy to change that. All we need to do is turn on environmental lighting. Now it's going to get a little bit better. Not too much. Because then we'll just need to change our color a little bit. So I like to put my horizon color as white, but you can really do any color that you please. Yeah, I'm just going to exit out. So if we make the horizon color completely white, zenith color, we'll change that to just ever so slightly blue. So what we'll do is change the environmental lighting color from white to sky color. So that's going to give us a little bit of blue, which adds that extra tiny bit of realism, which I find quite nice. Okay, so now if we were to render this, we already get a pretty decent result. I'm not using the fastest computer, so bear with me. So that's quite good, that's alright. Now, another thing we can do is add a sun lamp. And the sun lamp will give us a little bit of shadows and a bit more light and definition. So click the empty anywhere, shift A, lamp, sun. We can move it up a little bit. So the location of the sun lamp does not matter. What does matter is the rotation of it. So I'm just gonna rotate it a little bit. Yeah, in that direction is quite alright. A little bit in the Y. Yes, so this rotation is what's important with the sunlight. I think I'm gonna rotate it slightly on the Z. Something like this. Essentially, this is true north, by the way. That's true north. So east is over here, and what I'm trying to do is get just a little bit of a shadow of this building. So just rotate in this view here. Yep, that's quite good. And this will give us a few shadows in there. So if we go in the sunlight settings, so data settings, We already have the sun. We can change it, by the way, to anything we want. We'll just keep it as it is right now. And I like to make this one ever so slightly yellow. Reduce the energy to 0.5. It's important to give it a shadow, so let's give it a ray shadow. And now if we go to our view, which is Control 4 again if you're using the Uri Studio Hot settings, or just go to View Camera. And let's preview it again. The shortcut for previewing, for render preview, Shift Z. Okay, so now you can see we have a little bit of shadows as well. That's quite good. So the last thing we want to do then is add a few materials just to delineate it and add a bit extra depth to our scene. I'll just rotate this a little bit less in the Y direction. Something like this. Okay, so if we click any object, let's start with the context, and then this is the materials tab over here. Click new. We just added a material and just name it context. I usually like to make my context very, very sort of white, so it almost disappears. It's there, but you're not quite sure what it is. Alright, so then I click the ground plane, create a new material, call it ground. Ground, I always like it to be a little bit darker than most other things. What else do we have here? We have our fence. So you can create a new material for the fence. Let's call it fence. This one, I would like to make it a little bit darker as well. I'll click the top fence, and from the reference photos, it's actually painted quite dark. So just call this one fence 02. Change the diffuse to something even darker. Okay, and now we have our pavilion. This one I like to keep sort of a medium, a little bit darker than very bright, but not too dark, so we can see highlights, shadows, all that good stuff quite well. Oh, I didn't even know it's named Pavilion magically. Not sure why, but here it is. Yeah, so we'll make this one just a little bit darker. We'll make sure to apply it to the different objects that we have here. So now if we have an existing material, we can just click this icon here to sort of browse it, and when there are a lot, we can start also to type and get the right one. Okay, I believe that's it. Oh, the last one, I guess, is the rails that we have. And we'll add pavilion to that. It's become quite choppy, I'm noticing right now. We can change that. This is a little bit off topic, but it's bothering me. By changing the lattice values. Okay, that's a little bit better. Maybe if I change that to B-spline, it'll make it a little bit smoother. Yeah, it's still a little bit. Let's just change them all to B-spline then. Okay, that's a little bit better. Hopefully we didn't change it terribly too much. It's a little bit floating now. Sorry, I'm just gonna go and grab a couple of those. This is all covered, by the way, in a previous tutorial. If you haven't looked at it, it explains exactly how to do this. I'm just noticing now that as you can see, it's quite important sometimes to have camera views which are quite close to the object, because then we start to realize some things that didn't quite work the way we wanted them to do before. And that's what's happening here now. I'm noticing that some things just are not as I would have liked them to be. Right, so that's okay. I think if I just move this whole thing up, it may move my seats, because my seats... Nope, let's just undo that. Now my seats are shrinking. Yeah, so there's always something that could be fixed, I suppose. Just gonna isolate this object. It's Shift/ if you're using the UH Studio settings. Just because I more or less know what needs to happen with it. So scales at 0. Just made these exactly the same position. I'm gonna exit my isolation mode Again, you don't need to worry too much about what I'm doing right now because most of this is covered in the previous topic. I would just like to make sure that a couple of things. My object is not floating like it is at the moment. And that my seats are not too low. Yeah, it's quite wonderful when you can get to that level of detail just by setting up a simple camera, right? To take your concept much further. And I'm actually going in the wrong direction. Minus 0.5. Okay, so that's touching the ground. That's touching the ground. I just need to again fix this one here. And I need to open up my back again. Let's just add a few more here. Just see that my back is open. This is a bonus of further editing that you're getting here now that you may or may not appreciate. Hopefully you do. Okay, so that should be done. Cool. Okay, so that's quite nice. Everything's touching the ground. We have nice openings in the middle. It's much smoother than it was before, even though we can further refine it. But it's good enough for now. Okay, so here we have our view. We have our materials applied. Right, materials, pavilion. Let's make sure the bench has the pavilion material. Everything's got it. And then just last, and our slat supports, they also have it. Great, so now we're ready to go. The only other thing is I want to turn on the trees and just change the material for the trees a little bit more. And if you've watched the previous tutorials, you would know that to save memory and viewport performance, we've made them display just as the bounding box of the object. So now if I click on one of those, I believe this one here, and it would tell us what it is. So here's leaves. Okay, so get rid of this. Right, leaves. I'm not too worried about making these green at the moment. Just something a little bit darker. I click this bigger bounding box here, which is my tree. Ignore that it just had a material already that's called tree. I'll just make a new one that's called tree. If we have one with the same name, what it does is it puts a .001 in it. I already had one before, so that's okay. And I'll change this to something much darker. Okay, and now if we go back to our view, render preview it. So that's just very slight material definition would help us significantly in understanding, what's foreground, what's background, and what we really need to focus on. Which in this case, you see sort of all the buildings behind, they sort of fall to the background. So one thing I want to also adjust is my camera a little bit. I would like to be able to see the entrance, so I'm going to go to the quad view again. In this view, I'll set it as the camera, and in this view, just move the camera around. There you go. It's quite nice. It's got a little bit of, you can understand the depth that it has, and the fact that it's quite round from this view. Great, so now we have our view set up. Exit out of quad view. So now we're ready to render. If you go into the render settings, here we have the resolution, which I always actually keep it at 1920 by 1080. And here we have the percentage that we're using of this resolution. So for test renders, I like to use like 20, 30, 40%. Just to see how it looks without waiting for it to completely render. When you're ready, you can go to 100%, or even if you wanted to go higher res than that, you can just go to 200%. Anti-aliasing is fine. Performance, usually the tile size is 64. It is recommended to make it 16. That means that the little rendering boxes are smaller, but because most people use multi-core computers at the moment, it makes it go faster. And then we have the output, and the order of these could be slightly different in yours, and you can move them any way you want. I'll just leave them as they are, and here you can specify JPEG or PNG. For the time being we'll use JPEG. Right, okay, so now that's all set, and if we're ready to render, we just go up and hit the render button, and that's going to render just the active camera. And I'm going to pause my video and come back once it is done. It shouldn't take long, it's a minute, but it's still a minute I would not like to waste your time of. Okay, so here we have our rendering, which took about a minute, and it's 30%. I had left it to 200% before, and I was like, oh, that's gonna take a while, but I just exited it out. I just realized there's a couple more settings that I changed, which is in the sampling, in the world properties. Change that to adaptive. It just makes it a little bit faster, and then the fall off, we enable that and turn it to 0.1. And furthermore, we can add just a little bit of ambient occlusion to multiply, which would make these little corners here darker. Right, so here's our camera here. Again, this is only 30%, and it can render better when it's longer, but I think it already looks quite good for the speed that it takes. So if we want to save this image, we go to image, save as image, and we name it whatever we like. So I think this is view 03. So just name it view 03, and as you can see here, we can also override the settings that we set up in the rendering property. So if you decide we want a PNG, we can just put a PNG and then just click save as image, and we're ready. Okay, great. So the last thing we're going to cover now is how we can output all those cameras through a batch render. So if you go in this lower right hand corner here, we can expand, or we can change the view. We can, how should I say this? We can move this window and create a new window. So if you click and hold the triangle with your left mouse button, you see we create a new window here. We'll change the window type to text editor. And then in here, we can either click new. In your case, it will be clicking new and then pasting the information that you see in the link below. Or in my case, I already have it, and it's called render output. So this is just a very little script that goes and selects all the cameras and outputs them in a specific folder. I just like to turn on all these things which are script specific, so we can see things like comments and lines and so on. Okay, so the only thing we need to change here is this directory. Now, by default, Python uses arrows like you would in a website. So these are forward slashes, backward slashes. I'm not sure which ones they are, but it's like typing UA. So I think it's just the slash, isn't it? So it's uhstudio.com/tutorials, for example. Anyways, if we go to Windows, if you're using Windows, and we copy a directory, and then we paste it somewhere along here, what you see is that the slashes are backward slashes. So all we need to do is just go and change them. It's a little bit annoying. I'm sure there's a smarter way to do it. We just need to go and change all those to be forward slashes. Okay, and then we just need another slash at the end, otherwise you'll put the output to the name of the file. So then just Control X to cut. By the way, if you're in a Mac, you would still need to type all the shortcuts with Control and Control V to place it there, which is exactly the same as it was there. Woohoo! Great. So now once this starts to run, we just want to make sure all the settings are pretty well done and you're happy with the cameras, with the rendering settings. Make sure you save your file, and make sure also that you define your final resolution that you wish to have. The reason for that is that once we run the script, Blender is going to sort of freeze. It's not going to let us really do much because it's taking all the processing power to output our render views. So I'm going to save my file now, and then we can go to Windows if you're on Windows, and toggle System Console, which should show up somewhere. I think I had it on before, so I just turned it off. So here it is. And what it's going to do, you can even see, do we have it here? Yes. This is when it was running before, when I was setting up the cameras. It just shows you that it's running to the next camera. So this is going to be active. So if you have like hundreds of cameras, so you can sort of track when they're done, and it tells you how long it takes for each camera to render. Okay, so I'm going to leave this rendering. I'm going to pause again, and I'm just going to show you the final result. And then we're done with this tutorial series. Woohoo! Okay, so back just to show you the results of the batch renders with the settings that we discussed. So this is view 01, view 02, and view 03. Great, so hopefully by the end of this tutorial series you're able to create your own concepts similar to this one and display them in a very nice way. Thank you very much and see you next time.